The colony on Erythra was a small cluster of domed habitats spread across a barren red landscape. The ground cracked under the heat of the pale sun, and the air was thin, making every breath a small effort. Life here had never been easy. Generations of settlers had learned to live with scarcity, rationing water and food carefully, repairing broken machines themselves, and enduring storms that could tear through their fragile shelters in moments. They were a tough people, shaped by the harshness of their world, yet even they could feel fear when an invisible threat began to grow among them. It started slowly. At first, a few settlers complained of headaches and fevers. The medics thought it was the heat, or perhaps stress, or even a rare reaction to a new type of algae used in their food. But soon, more people fell ill, and the symptoms worsened. Strong adults who had survived every challenge Erythra had thrown at them began to weaken, unable to stand for long periods. The children, normally full of energy and mischief, grew pale and listless. The illness spread like fire, and the medics worked day and night, trying everything they knew. But nothing seemed to help. The colonists were not only fighting disease. Supplies were running low. Each week, they sent distress messages into the void, but the Galactic Council, busy with conflicts and crises in more populated sectors, could not respond. Each unanswered transmission added weight to the despair that already hung over the settlement like a heavy fog. The people began to gather in the observation dome at night, staring up at the stars. They whispered their hopes into the darkness, sending messages into the universe. They begged for help, for a sign, for anything that might ease their suffering. Some wrote letters and attached them to small signal probes, hoping that even if they never returned, someone would find them someday. Families clung to each other. Parents held their children close, brushing away the sweat and dust from their small faces, murmuring words of reassurance they did not truly feel. Elders shared stories of the early days of the colony, of how they had survived storms, power failures, and strange creatures that roamed near the edge of their territory. These stories were meant to calm, to remind everyone that humans could endure. Yet, as they listened to the wind whip across the barren hills and watched the shadows stretch in the flickering light of their lanterns, a chill of dread crept into even the bravest hearts. Whispers began circulating about something seen beyond the borders of the colony. Shadows moving in ways that did not seem natural, shapes glimpsed in the distance that vanished before anyone could approach. No one knew exactly what they were, but old legends spoke of the Deathworlders, strange and deadly creatures that lived in isolation far from human settlements. Most dismissed the stories as exaggeration, tales to scare children. But as more sightings occurred and strange tracks appeared near water sources, even the skeptics felt unease. Mothers checked their children's sleeping spaces repeatedly, and fathers patrolled the outer fences with makeshift weapons. Every night became a vigil. Every creak or whisper in the wind became a potential sign of danger. Despite the fear, the colonists held on to hope. They organized patrols, tending to crops and water supplies with as much care as ever, even though each day seemed to bring new challenges. Engineers worked tirelessly to repair failing machines and filters, while medics experimented with medicines. Some improvised from what little resources remained. The community relied on one another more than ever, sharing responsibilities and comforting those too weak to work. Bonds grew stronger in hardship, and though despair lurked in quiet corners, small victories, a successful crop harvest, a child recovering from illness, a repaired generator, brought brief moments of joy. Yet at night, when the dome lights flickered and the sky stretched endlessly above, the colonists' minds returned to the same haunting question. Were they truly alone in the universe? Their pleas, sent in the form of signals and probes, drifted silently through the void. They begged the stars to answer, to send help, to intervene in some way they could not even imagine. Every person in the colony, from the youngest child to The oldest elder whispered their own version of that plea. Some asked for safety, some for the healing of the sick, and some simply for reassurance that they had not been forgotten. The universe offered no response, only the quiet hum of distant lights and the cold emptiness that reminded them how small and fragile they truly were. Still, life went on. Children played in the small courtyards, laughing despite the fear around them. Adults tended to their tasks, repairing broken roofs or reinforcing walls against the harsh winds. Even as illness claimed more lives, the community found ways to honor those who were lost. Names were spoken softly, memories shared, and lessons learned. Every death, though painful, became a reminder of the stakes they faced, and a motivation to survive. It was this stubborn determination, the refusal to surrender to despair, that gave the colony a fragile strength. And yet, in the deepest nights, the whispers of shadows beyond the domes grew louder. Strange shapes moved in the distance, and strange sounds echoed across the barren hills. The colonists could no longer ignore the signs. Whatever was coming was patient and relentless, and it did not respect human boundaries. Every moment of silence, every unanswered signal, felt like a countdown to something larger, something that would test their endurance and courage in ways they had never imagined. The colonists did not know what form this threat would take, but they sensed its inevitability. The stars, for all their beauty and majesty, seemed to watch silently, withholding the answer they had begged for. And as the cold night settled over the colony, a quiet determination settled in the hearts of the settlers. They would endure. They would fight. They would survive no matter the cost, even if the universe itself seemed indifferent to their struggle. In the dome, under the pale light of distant suns, they made a silent promise. They begged the stars for aid, whispered their hopes into the dark, and waited. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the first shadows of what was to come began to stir. Life on Erythra was becoming harder with each passing day. The illness that had first appeared slowly was now spreading more quickly, and the colony's supplies were dwindling fast. Water had to be rationed carefully, and food portions were smaller than ever. Families worried constantly about whether they would have enough to last another week, another day. Sleep became scarce as parents stayed awake at night to tend to sick children, while medics worked tirelessly in overcrowded infirmaries. Every day brought new challenges, and every night brought more fear. Amid this struggle, the colonists began noticing something that disturbed them even more. Strange signs appeared around the borders of the settlement. Large, uneven tracks were found near the water sources. Shadows moved across the hills at night, just out of reach of the colony's lights. Some settlers reported hearing low, rumbling sounds in the distance, almost like the growl of a massive animal, but deeper, stranger, and more terrifying. No one had ever seen anything like it before. These signs were unlike any natural phenomena they had encountered on Erythra. Stories began circulating about the Deathworlders, creatures from old colony legends said to hunt entire settlements without mercy. At first, many dismissed these tales as myths meant to scare children or newcomers. But as more tracks were found and mysterious movements were seen at the edges of the colony, even the skeptics began to feel uneasy. Mothers would peek out of their domes, eyes scanning the horizon, and fathers patrolled with weapons that were little more than tools and hope. Children were warned to stay inside after sunset, and even the bravest workers moved with a caution they had never shown before. A council of leaders gathered to discuss the situation. They debated fiercely about what to do. Some argued for evacuation, saying that no community could survive both illness and the approaching creatures. Others believed that abandoning the colony would mean certain death anyway, and that their only chance was to stay, strengthen their shelters, and fight if necessary. The argument went back and forth for hours. Some leaders were influenced by fear, others by hope. The tension in the room was thick, almost as if the walls themselves felt it. While the leaders argued, the colonists took matters into their own hands. Engineers began reinforcing the domes with extra layers of metal and protective screens. They repaired old machinery that had been left broken for years, creating barriers and traps in case the Deathworlders came too close. Medics worked tirelessly, trying new remedies to slow the spread of disease, using every resource they could find. Volunteers carried supplies from one dome to another, ensuring that families had what little they needed to survive. Despite exhaustion and fear, the people moved with determination, each step a quiet act of defiance against the harshness of their world. Nighttime brought the most anxiety. The stars above, once a source of wonder, now seemed cold and distant, watching silently as the colonists struggled. Every rustle of wind through the domes, every flicker of light across the hills, was a reminder that something dangerous might be approaching. The children huddled close to their parents, whispering questions they didn't fully understand. The adults, in turn, tried to comfort them while hiding their own fear. In these quiet moments, the full weight of their isolation pressed down. The colony was far from any help, their messages for aid still drifting unanswered into the void. As days passed, the signs of the Deathworlders grew more frequent. Scouts reported seeing large shapes moving through the distant valleys, moving with a strange, silent precision. Tracks of enormous size were left in mud and sand near the outer fences. One evening, a group of farmers returning from the water reservoir claimed they had seen glowing eyes staring at them from a ridge. They had run back to the colony without looking back, hearts pounding, breath heavy with panic. That night, families bolted doors and double-checked alarms. Sleep became almost impossible. The growing presence of the Deathworlders forced the colony to adapt. Every task, from collecting water to tending crops, required vigilance. Groups of settlers patrolled in shifts, scanning the horizon for movement. Engineers modified alarms to detect vibrations or sounds that humans might miss. Even the medics, who had been solely focused on treating illness, joined the watch. Every person became part of a defensive effort, their survival dependent on alertness and cooperation. The colony was no longer just a place to live. It was a fortress, fragile but determined. Amid all this, the leaders continued sending signals into the void. They doubled their efforts, hoping for guidance, aid, or even just reassurance that they were not entirely alone. Families wrote messages to the stars, attaching small probes and letting them drift into space, hoping that someone, somewhere would receive them. In the observation dome, the colonists often gathered in silence, staring at the distant suns, whispering prayers or wishes that help would come. Each unanswered signal was another test of their patience and courage. Despite fear and uncertainty, small victories kept hope alive. A newly repaired greenhouse produced a modest harvest. A sick child began to recover after days of careful treatment. Volunteers successfully reinforced the perimeter with sensors and lights to give early warnings of approaching dangers. These achievements, though small, reminded the colonists that they were capable of fighting back, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Each success strengthened their resolve, preparing them unknowingly for the moment when the Deathworlders would finally arrive. By the end of this period, the colony had become a mix of resilience and fear. Every person knew that the next encounter could be deadly, yet they carried on. They continued their daily routines while constantly scanning the horizon, tending to the sick while keeping watch for shadows. They understood that survival depended on unity, courage, and quick thinking. And while the stars had not yet answered their pleas, the colonists had learned a deeper lesson. Hope alone was not enough. Action, ingenuity, and unwavering determination were their true tools for survival. In the quietest moments, when the wind whispered across the barren hills, the colonists felt the presence of something larger than themselves. The Deathworlders were out there, patient and calculating, but the people of Erythra would not give up. They would prepare, defend, and endure. Every step, every choice, was a preparation for the inevitable confrontation. And even as night fell and the stars gleamed, coldly above, the colony held on to a fragile, stubborn hope that somehow they would survive the coming storm. The first signs of the Deathworlders' arrival began subtly. At first, it was the faint rumble beneath the ground, a vibration so low that most settlers barely noticed it at first. Then shadows began to move across the outer fences, shapes too large and unnatural to belong to any known creature on Erythra. Panic rippled through the colony like a rising tide, though many tried to hide it, hoping that calm would prevent fear from spreading further. One evening, as the twin suns began to dip behind distant hills, the first full sighting occurred. Scouts, returning from a routine perimeter check, reported enormous insectoid creatures advancing slowly but deliberately toward the settlement. Their exoskeletons shimmered in the fading light, and their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dome's lights like unearthly lanterns. The scouts ran back to the colony as fast as they could, tripping over rough terrain, shouting warnings. By the time they reached the gates, the panic had already spread, and families were rushing to secure their homes. The colony's alarms blared for the first time in months. Doors and protective barriers were locked, lights flashed across the domes, and the people scrambled to find each other. Parents grabbed children, while volunteers tried to gather the elderly and infirm into the safest shelters. There was no time for hesitation. Every second mattered. The colony had been preparing for this moment, yet nothing could fully prepare them for the reality of seeing the Deathworlders up close, towering, alien, and merciless. Some settlers tried to communicate. Flares were shot into the sky, and signals were sent through emergency channels. Perhaps they thought the creatures could be reasoned with or deterred. But the Deathworlders did not hesitate, did not pause, and did not seem aware of the human attempts at diplomacy. Their movements were precise, purposeful, and terrifyingly deliberate. Entire sectors of the colony were quickly overrun, forcing settlers to retreat to inner domes and shelters. Flames and smoke rose in some areas where defenses failed, the crackling fire a grim reminder of how fragile their homes truly were. Amid the chaos, a small group of volunteers took charge of evacuation efforts. They were responsible for leading families with young children and the elderly to underground shelters designed for emergencies. Paths had been carefully planned, with escape routes that wove through less accessible terrain. The volunteers moved quickly, their faces tight with determination. Every step was dangerous. The Deathworlders were patient hunters, and they could detect movement easily. Yet the colonists pressed on, supporting each other, carrying supplies, and shielding the vulnerable whenever possible. Inside the shelters, fear mixed with a tense sense of hope. Families huddled together, holding each other close while listening to the chaos outside. The roar of the Deathworlders, low and guttural, echoed through the hills. The walls of the shelters trembled with every step the creatures took above. Children cried quietly, frightened by the sounds, while adults whispered reassurances they barely believed themselves. The colonists knew that survival depended not only on staying safe, but also on keeping calm. Panic could be as dangerous as the creatures themselves. Outside, engineers and volunteers worked frantically to repair or improvise defensive measures. Barricades were reinforced, alarms were reset, and sensors were activated to give the earliest possible warning of approaching threats. The settlers had spent months preparing for a disaster like this, yet the real confrontation tested every plan, every tool, and every skill they had honed. Improvised weapons were distributed, and even basic tools were used as protection when necessary. The colony's resourcefulness was its most important weapon, perhaps even more vital than any physical barrier. As the night wore on, the Deathworlders pressed closer. Their movements revealed intelligence and strategy. They did not attack blindly. Instead, they seemed to understand the layout of the colony, avoiding traps at first and focusing on areas that were less fortified. Every encounter with them was a test of both courage and quick thinking. Volunteers guided groups of settlers along safer routes, using every shadow, every ridge, and every abandoned path to their advantage. Exhaustion was everywhere, faces pale, hands trembling, but the determination to survive pushed the colonists onward. Inside the shelters, stories of past hardships circulated among the people. Elders reminded everyone of storms, machinery failures, and other threats the colony had survived. These memories were meant to strengthen morale, to remind the colonists that they were capable of enduring even the most dangerous challenges. In hushed voices, parents explained to children why they had to be brave, why courage mattered even when facing something larger and more terrifying than themselves. It was not just survival of the body, but also of the spirit. By midnight, the first significant breaches occurred. A smaller dome, less fortified than the main habitat, was damaged when the Deathworlders' strength tested the barriers. Smoke filled the air, and settlers inside had to evacuate quickly, led by volunteers who risked their lives to guide them to safer zones. Despite losses and setbacks, the colonists adapted rapidly. Every failure was a lesson, and every action, taken in desperation, increased their chances of survival. The night became a mix of terror, ingenuity, and stubborn determination. Even as destruction surrounded them, there were moments of quiet heroism. A father shielded his child with his own body from falling debris. A medic carried supplies across exposed terrain to reach those trapped in damaged shelters. Volunteers held back the creatures long enough for entire groups to escape through underground tunnels. These acts of courage, though small against the scale of the threat, kept hope alive and reminded the settlers that they were not helpless. The colony was not just a collection of buildings. It was a community bound together by survival, courage, and care for one another. When dawn finally approached, the colony was battered but still standing. Smoke rose from damaged domes, and the once pristine landscape was scarred with enormous tracks and flattened equipment. The Deathworlders had not yet breached the central habitat, and many of the settlers had survived thanks to careful planning, bravery, and the willingness to act despite fear. Families emerged from shelters, eyes wide with shock and exhaustion, taking in the scene of destruction and realizing the cost of the night's events. Even in the aftermath, there was no time to rest fully. The colony needed to regroup, repair, and prepare for the next move. Everyone knew the Deathworlders were not finished. Their arrival had been only the beginning, a demonstration of the danger that now loomed over the settlement. The colonists, though shaken, felt a growing determination. They had faced the unknown and survived the first encounter. That experience, terrifying as it was, gave them insight into the creatures' patterns, their strengths, and, perhaps most importantly, their vulnerabilities. In the observation dome, settlers stared at the sky once more, remembering the pleas they had sent into the void. The stars remained silent, yet the colonists felt a strange resilience growing among them. They had faced the Deathworlders and lived. They had relied on one another, used their knowledge, and adapted under extreme pressure. The first confrontation had shown them the reality of the threat, but it had also revealed their own strength. By the time the sun rose fully, the colony was alive with movement. Volunteers moved between shelters, repairing what could be fixed immediately. Medics tended to injuries sustained during the night. Children, though scared, were comforted and fed. Adults coordinated new defensive measures, discussing ways to improve their safety for the next encounter. The colony had learned that survival was not a single act, but a series of careful, brave, and persistent choices. Though the night had brought terror, it had also given the settlers hope. They had survived, they had learned, and they had grown stronger. The Deathworlders were out there, patient and relentless, but the colonists now understood that they could respond, adapt, and, if necessary, fight back. Every shadow, every rumble, every glowing eye in the distance was a reminder of danger, but also of the courage and unity that would be required to endure what was yet to come. The morning after the first encounter with the Deathworlders brought both relief and a renewed sense of urgency. The colony had survived, but the danger was far from over. Settlers emerged from shelters, eyes still wide with exhaustion, as they assessed the damage. Smoke rose from damaged domes, and the landscape bore deep tracks from the massive alien creatures. Supplies were scattered, and some sections of the outer perimeter had been completely destroyed. Despite the fear, the people of Erythra began to plan their next steps. Survival was no longer just about hiding. It required action, ingenuity, and courage. As the leaders convened in the main dome, a small group of engineers made a startling discovery. During the night, while analyzing sensor data, they realized that the Deathworlders seemed highly sensitive to certain frequencies emitted by the colony's older communication arrays. The creatures had avoided areas with specific signals and seemed confused or repelled by them. This realization sparked hope. If they could amplify and manipulate these signals, the colonists might be able to drive the Deathworlders away temporarily, or at least slow their advance long enough to protect the most vulnerable. Immediately, a plan was devised. The engineers began gathering old transmitters, signal amplifiers, and any electronic equipment that could be repurposed. Volunteers carried heavy machinery across rough terrain, often risking exposure to the creatures still lurking nearby. Every action was fraught with danger, but the settlers moved with determination, understanding that their ingenuity could mean the difference between life and death. Even children helped in small ways, passing tools and relaying messages, contributing to the effort in the only ways they could. While the engineers and volunteers worked, other groups focused on reinforcing defenses. Barricades were rebuilt and strengthened, sensors were placed strategically around the colony, and early warning systems were tested again. Medics prepared emergency supplies for injuries that might occur during the next encounter. Families were moved to the safest domes and shelters, and routes were mapped for quick evacuation if necessary. The colony had become a hive of organized activity, every person contributing to the survival of the whole. Fear was present, but it was balanced by purpose. The construction of the signal device was grueling. The engineers had to combine old, sometimes malfunctioning equipment with improvised materials, creating something entirely new under extreme pressure. They worked through the night, fueled by determination and the knowledge that lives depended on their success. Sparks flew. Wires were connected and reconnected, and every failure taught them how to improve. The air was thick with tension, but also a quiet excitement. If they could succeed, the colony might finally have a weapon that could turn the tide. Meanwhile, the Deathworlders remained near the outer perimeter, observing, waiting. They did. Not rush in as before, but moved with calculated patience, as if testing the colony's defenses. Scouts reported their positions, noting patterns in their movements. It became clear that the creatures were intelligent, capable of learning, and aware of the settlers' activities. Every step had to be carefully planned. Volunteers who had fought the first night understood the danger intimately. They knew how easily a misstep could lead to disaster. Yet, despite exhaustion, they pressed on, using everything they had learned to stay one step ahead. Finally, after long hours of meticulous work, the signal device was ready. Engineers and volunteers gathered, faces drawn and tired, yet filled with a quiet sense of hope. The device was large, strange-looking, a patchwork of repurposed machinery and new wiring. When activated, it emitted a powerful frequency designed to confuse and repel the Deathworlders. Everyone understood it might not be permanent or even completely effective, but it was their best chance. The signal could buy time. Time to protect families, time to reinforce shelters, time to prepare for whatever came next. When the signal was activated, a tense silence fell over the colony. The low hum of the device filled the air, vibrating through the ground and across the domes. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then, slowly, the Deathworlders began to shift. They hesitated at the edges of the perimeter, moving more cautiously than before. Some creatures turned away, retreating just enough to reduce immediate danger. The colonists watched with a mixture of relief and astonishment, realizing that their plan was working. For the first time, they had a measure of control over the situation. The effect was not permanent, and the colony knew it. The signal could only hold the Deathworlders back for so long. Volunteers continued to reinforce defenses and move vulnerable settlers to the safest locations. Every hour counted. Every action mattered. The colony worked as a unified organism, each member aware of their role in ensuring survival. Children learned quickly to stay out of dangerous areas, assisting when possible. Adults coordinated tirelessly, improvising solutions to unexpected problems. The night, which once would have brought paralyzing fear, now became a test of skill, courage, and unity. In addition to the immediate threat, the colonists faced internal challenges. Fear and exhaustion weighed heavily on everyone, and tensions occasionally flared. Some argued over strategies, while others expressed frustration at limited resources. Yet, even in moments of disagreement, the community held together. Elders reminded younger settlers of past hardships they had overcome, and families shared stories to maintain morale. Each person understood that survival depended on unity and resilience. Arguments were set aside when the creatures approached, and cooperation became a matter of life and death. By dawn, the first test of the signal had ended. The Deathworlders had retreated, at least temporarily, giving the colony a moment to breathe. Volunteers carried the sick and injured to safer domes, medics treated minor injuries, and engineers inspected the devices to ensure they remained functional. There was still much work to do. Supplies were low, some defenses had been damaged, and the creatures were still near. But the settlers had proven something crucial. They could fight back, they could adapt, and they could survive. The experience taught the colony a vital lesson. Survival on Erythra would not come from hiding or waiting for outside aid alone. It required action, intelligence, and courage. Every person had a role, and every choice could mean life or death. The Deathworlders were formidable, patient, and intelligent, but the settlers had found a way to turn fear into strategy. The Night of Chaos had become a turning point, showing that even against overwhelming odds, determination and ingenuity could create opportunities for survival. As the sun rose over the barren hills, the colony looked different than it had before. There was damage, yes, but also a sense of resilience and purpose. People moved with careful confidence, knowing they had faced the Deathworlders and survived. They continued to send signals into the void, their pleas now combined with evidence of their ingenuity. Perhaps the universe had not answered directly, but the colonists had found a way to act, to defend themselves, and to hope. The turning point had arrived. The settlers were no longer merely victims of circumstance. They were active participants in their own survival. And though the threat of the Deathworlders was far from over, the colony had learned a crucial truth. Even the most terrifying dangers could be met with courage, ingenuity, and unity. The night of terror had passed, but the fight for survival would continue, stronger and wiser than before. The dawn that followed the battle with the Deathworlders was quiet, almost surreal. The colony had survived, but the scars of the night were evident everywhere. Smoke still drifted from damaged domes, the ground bore massive tracks, and supplies were scattered across the barren landscape. Yet despite the destruction, a sense of determination ran through the settlers. They had endured the worst, adapted, and even discovered ways to defend themselves. This victory, though fragile, had strengthened their resolve. Families emerged, from shelters cautiously, checking on neighbors and friends. Children, though frightened, clung to parents while peeking at the damaged terrain. Adults moved quickly, assessing what needed immediate attention. Medics tended to the sick and injured, ensuring no one was left behind. Volunteers carried debris, repaired broken barriers, and re-established critical equipment. The colony had faced disaster, and now it was a race to stabilize what remained. Every effort mattered. The settlers understood that while the Deathworlders had retreated temporarily, the threat was far from gone. During the morning, a council of leaders gathered to evaluate the colony's situation. They reviewed sensor data, reports from volunteers, and the results of the signal device. It had worked better than anyone had dared hope. The Deathworlders had been repelled, at least for a while, giving the settlers precious time to reinforce defenses and protect the vulnerable. The engineers were already planning upgrades to the signal system, making it stronger and more efficient. Every detail was considered carefully. The next encounter had to be met with even greater preparation. Amid the ongoing repairs, the colonists received a new and unexpected development. A signal arrived from an advanced fleet in a nearby sector. The message was brief, but it offered guidance, instructions for survival, and the coordinates of a nearby safe haven. The settlers had been pleading for help from the stars, and now, finally, a response had arrived. It was not immediate rescue, but it was hope, a lifeline in the vast emptiness of space. Families and volunteers gathered around the communication panels, faces lighting up with relief and cautious optimism. The universe had not abandoned them completely. Even with this hope, the colony had to remain vigilant. The Deathworlders could return at any moment, and the planet itself offered no forgiveness for mistakes. Volunteers continued patrols, repaired barriers, and reinforced shelters. Engineers worked on improving the signal device, while medics ensured everyone was healthy, enough to continue defending the colony. The experience of the previous night had taught them that survival required constant attention and effort. Every person, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, had a role to play. No one was idle, because in a world like Erythra, every action could be a matter of life or death. Families began to share stories of bravery and sacrifice from the past days. Parents told children about the volunteers who had risked their lives to guide the vulnerable, medics who worked tirelessly despite exhaustion, and engineers who had built the device that had saved them all. These stories were not just tales of survival. They were lessons in courage, unity, and hope. Even as the colony faced destruction and fear, these narratives reminded everyone of the strength that came from working together. The community had become stronger, more resilient, and more determined. The signal from the advanced fleet provided more than just instructions. It also inspired a new sense of purpose. The settlers realized that while the universe might be indifferent, at times it was not entirely silent. Their ingenuity, courage, and persistence had earned them a chance, not immediate salvation, but guidance and hope. The stars had listened. The pleas that had once seemed futile now had meaning. The settlers had discovered that even in the face of overwhelming odds, action and determination could shape their fate. In the days that followed, the colony began planning a long-term strategy for survival. The safe haven provided by the fleet was a distant goal, requiring careful preparation and coordination. Supplies had to be managed, pathways cleared, and defensive measures maintained until the journey could begin. Yet even in the midst of this planning, the settlers found moments of peace and reflection. Children played cautiously in the courtyards, adults shared meals and conversation, and elders offered wisdom about enduring hardship. The colony was battered but alive, its spirit unbroken. The experience of the Deathworlders had left a lasting impression. The settlers had faced creatures of immense strength and intelligence, yet they had survived through courage, ingenuity, and cooperation. They had learned the importance of preparation, vigilance, and unity. Every small victory, repairing a barrier, saving a life, or driving the creatures back with the signal device, had reinforced the lesson that they were capable of overcoming even the most terrifying challenges. The night of chaos had become a defining moment, shaping a community that would endure. As the sun rose higher over the barren hills, the colonists looked to the horizon with renewed determination. The landscape bore scars of the recent battle, but it also bore evidence of their resilience. Tracks left by the Deathworlders were reminders of the threat they had faced, but the repaired domes and fortified shelters symbolized their strength. The colony had survived not by chance, but through courage, planning, and the refusal to give up. They understood that the universe was vast and often indifferent, but they had also learned that perseverance, hope, and action could create opportunities, even in the darkest circumstances. Finally, as the settlement settled into a new rhythm, the colonists gathered in the observation dome. Together, they looked up at the stars that had once seemed distant and uncaring. Now, with the guidance from the fleet, the survivors felt a renewed connection to the larger universe. They had faced death, fear, and uncertainty, yet they had endured. They had learned that survival required more than just hope. It required unity, courage, and the willingness to act, even when the odds were overwhelming. The colony's story was far from over. The Deathworlders still lurked nearby, and the journey to the safe haven promised by the fleet would be long and dangerous. Yet the settlers faced the future with a sense of confidence they had never known before. They had survived impossible odds, adapted to terrifying threats, and discovered their own strength. In the vast emptiness of Erythra, they had learned that humanity's greatest power lay not in technology or weapons alone, but in courage, cooperation, and the determination to keep moving forward, no matter how dark the night or how silent the stars. The people of Erythra had survived. They had begged the stars for aid, faced unimaginable danger, and found hope where none seemed possible. And as they prepared for the days and challenges ahead, they carried with them the knowledge that even in a universe that could be cold and indifferent, courage and determination could light a path forward. Together they would endure, rebuild, and continue their journey, guided by the stars, strengthened by their trials, and bound together by the shared experience of survival against the odds.